Since many of you didn't understand much of my alternate history videos because you don't know the actual history, I'm going to make this video. And since my videos are mostly about the late Middle Ages and modern history, I'll just go over the minimum in history before then in order for you to understand those eras. And I will do more videos on the history of more regions, and I will do more alternate history timelines, but first let's define where the Middle East and Balkans are, right here. So why did I combine these two areas for this video? Well, it's because I like weird transcontinental, shall we call them, zones? And people love Game of Thrones, and the history of this region of the world is like the show Game of Thrones. In fact, both the Balkans and the Middle East are notorious for the countries in them hating each other. So let's start off in the 7th millennium BC in Sumer. Tribes eventually started to form proto-city-states at this time, which were divided by canals and boundary stones. Each was centered on a temple dedicated to the particular patron god or goddesses of the city and ruled over by a priestly governor called an Entsi or by a king called a Lugal, who was intimately tied to the city's religious rites. Permanent year-round urban settlements may have been prompted by intensive agricultural practices. The work required in maintaining irrigation canals called for, and the resulting surplus of food enabled relatively concentrated populations. The centers of Eridu and Uruk, two of the earliest cities, had successfully elaborated large temple complexes built of mud brick. These city-states rose to power during the prehistoric Ubaid and Uruk periods. Around this time we see the rise of the, however you say this, culture that consisted of high-density small settlements. The end of the Uruk period coincided with the Pura Oscillation, a dry period from about 3200 to 2900 BC that marked the end of a long, wetter, warmer climate period from about 9000 to 5000 years ago, called the Holocene climate. It was thanks to the innovations I mentioned that the vast majority of an area's population was no longer necessary to supply it with food, allowing a sizable minority to create hierarchies in law and war. Back to the previous culture I was talking about, during its middle phase, about 4000 to 3500 BC, populations belonging to it built the largest settlements in Neolithic Europe, some of which contained as many as 3,000 structures and were possibly inhabited by 20,000 to 46,000 people. Around the end of the 4th millennia BC, a city named Ebla grew rapidly, supported by many satellite agricultural settlements and benefiting from its role as an entrepot of growing international trade, which probably began with an increased demand for wool in Sumer. Meanwhile, in Egypt around 3000 BC, a similar process had been happening, where in northern and southern Egypt two kingdoms formed and unified by their royalty marrying each other. The first king of both of these kingdoms became the first ruler of the first ever empire, Pharaoh Narmer. Slightly later, around 2900 BC, a shift in Sumer occurred from the temple established headed by a council of elders led by a priestly En towards a more secular Lugal, Lu meaning man and Gal meaning great, and the now deciphered syllabic writing started to develop from the early pictograms, and Ebla's growth caused it to become a kingdom, the most prominent kingdom among the Syrian states, especially during the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, and later on becoming the Eblaite Empire, an early Indo-European and a more violent patriarchal people called the Kurgan expanded into where the more peaceful culture I spoke about inhabited, permanently ending it. Around the 3rd millennium BC, all of the southern Sumerian city-states were united. Later, they united city-states as far north as Mari and as far east as Susa. Moving on in the 24th century BC, the city of Kish, which was the linchpin connecting Mari and Susa to the Sumerian kingdom, gained independence, and we would see the next empire emerge by a ruler of Kish conquering the rest of Mesopotamia and beyond. This was the Akkadian Empire. Then, due to a variety of reasons, around 2154 BC it collapsed. One of the cities in it, named Kazalu, briefly became a city-state in its own right, conquering a number of its immediate neighbors. After the collapse of Akkad, there was a brief dark age followed by a power struggle among the most powerful city-states created in the ruin of the Akkadian Empire, and and eventually a new Sumerian dynasty that centered its empire around the city of Ur emerged victorious around 2112 BC, which quickly conquered the rest of the Fertile Crescent. The capital of one of the provinces of the new Sumerian empire, Susa, under its governor rebelled and made it an independent state and literary center, unifying neighboring territories, becoming the kingdom of Elam. Slightly later, in 2025 BC, a city on the outskirts of the Neo-Sumerian Empire called Assur had been producing merchants who developed lucrative trade routes. Along with this prosperity came geopolitical relevance. A bit later, in 2000 BC, we see the ancient Greeks emerge as a result of the Indo-Europeans, probably the Kurgan culture, mixing with prehistoric Europeans. Then the Egyptians invaded some city-states in Canaan and made them satellite states of Egypt. And the Sumerians launched military campaigns into Elam but did not manage to penetrate far into the country. Next, the Elamites, allied with the people of Susa, fought back and managed to sack Ur, the capital of the Neo-Sumerian Empire, and captured the king of Sumeria. Meanwhile, at this time, other prehistoric cultures became Indo-Europeanized into the Dacians, Getae, and Thracians. The Getae and Dacians were a part of an Indo-European group that stretched all the way from Ireland into Iraq called the Celts, while the Thracians were Hellenic, which means they were related to the ancient Greeks. A city which was a vassal of the Eblaite Empire called Halab was taken over by the Yamhadite dynasty and renamed Yamhad. The city-state Assur expanded through conquest, creating the nation Assyria. Meanwhile, closer to Elam, a new kid showed up on the block called Babylonia by declaring independence from Khazalu. Some people of unknown origin called the Hyksos established a state called Avaris in the northern Nile Delta and began a conquest of most of northern Egypt. The Yamhadite dynasty was turned into the most influential family in the Levant through both diplomatic and military tools, to the point where the former Eblaite Empire was now a vassal of the kingdom of Yamhad, and a new people began to dominate an area in between Assyria and ancient Greece. Babylon expanded so much during this time that it defeated Assyria and placed a puppet in power. The Hittite Empire formed from the indigenous Hatti people uniting with an invading people, the Neshites, and conquered much of modern-day Anatolia, and Babylon lost its influence over Assyria. Sometime in the late 18th to early 17th century BC, the Hittite expansion stopped at the kingdom of Yamhad. A people from the Iranian plateau called the Kassites attacked Babylonia, but were horribly repelled. Humiliated, they set up their own civilization to the northwest of Babylonia, waiting for the right time to strike. The Hyksos invaded the rest of Egypt and proceeded to make what was left of it into a vassal centered around Thebes, and the Hittites went east, walking on the backs of the Kassites, but not taking much from them since they didn't have much to take, moving further all the way over to Babylon and plundering it. The Hittites conquered and destroyed the kingdom of Yamhad, allowing a people called the Mitanni to seize power, and to the west emerged a group of Indo-European tribes called the Illyrians. And the largest volcanic eruption in European history happened in modern-day Greece. The island of Crete was greatly damaged by it, and warlike Proto-Greek tribes took advantage of this, which gave them dominance over the Aegean and Adriatic seas, and the Kassites gained control of Babylon in 1570 BC, some 25 years after the fall of Babylon to the Hittites, and went on to conquer the southern parts of Mesopotamia. The Theban Egyptians overthrew the Hyksos, and as a backlash to being ruled by foreigners for over 2 centuries, became more warlike and conquered modern-day Sudan and fought wars against the Mitanni over much of Syria until eventually making peace with them. The Egyptians conquered some coastal cities such as Byblos, Arwad, and Ulasa for their crucial geographic and commercial links with the interior via the Nahr al-Kabir and the Orontes rivers. The cities provided Egypt with access to Mesopotamian trade, as well as abundant stocks of the region's native cedar wood, of which there was no equivalent equivalent in the Egyptian homeland. By the mid-14th century, these cities were considered favored cities to the Egyptians. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Byblos were regarded as the most important. Their inhabitants, the Canaanites, had considerable autonomy, and their cities were fairly well developed and prosperous. Byblos was eventually the leading city outside of Egypt proper. It was a major center of bronze making and the primary terminus of precious goods such as tin, lapis lazuli, found as far east as Afghanistan. Sidon and Tyre also commanded interest among Egyptian officials, beginning a pattern of rivalry that would span the next millennium. The Mitanni were completely conquered by the Assyrians and Hittites. For the next couple decades, Hittites would clash violently in a series of epic battles against the Assyrians and eventually made peace with the Egyptians like the Mitanni had done. But along with the Babylonians, lost much of their territory to the Assyrians. Then the Egyptians, Hittites, and most of the nearby Greeks agreed to a trade embargo against the Assyrians, whom they all feared the rapid expansion of. Since the Assyrians couldn't invade west or south, they looked north to the Nairi lands in between the modern Caucasus and Kurdistan that were inhabited by a number of principalities who the Assyrians defeated 40 of and extradited tribute from. With many of them being weakened, one of them called the Urartu took advantage and began a process of slowly taking over them. The Assyrian and Egyptian empires both contracted following this due to famine, and some Libyans took advantage of this and invaded Egypt, causing it to fall into many smaller states. Meanwhile, even more violent Greek tribes called the Dorian Greeks invaded most of the rest of Greece, forcing the Greeks to move east, colonizing western Anatolia, nearby islands, and Cyprus. When the Dorians expanded into continental Europe, they mixed with the Thracians and Illyrians, creating the ancient Macedonians. And the 12 tribes of Israel conquered parts of Canaan south of the ones I said were favored among the Egyptians and wiped out the Canaanites in their conquered territories. The surviving Canaanites became the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians appear to have weathered the crisis relatively well, emerging as a distinct and organized civilization. This period is even sometimes described as a Phoenician Renaissance of sorts. They filled the power vacuum caused by the late Bronze Age collapse by becoming the sole mercantile and maritime power in the region, a status they would maintain for the next several centuries. Greece also went into a dark age of depopulation for the same reason why Egypt and Syria contracted. The period of contracting in the Greek Dark Ages is known as the Bronze Age collapse. It saw great upheavals and mass movements of peoples across not just the Middle East and Balkans but also the Maghreb, leading to the genesis of new peoples and polities across the regions, namely the Arameans and Chaldeans. For protection against outside powers, the Oahe tribes formed a confederacy, and over time the battered border tribes gave way in favor of the internal kingdom of Colchis, and the Assyrian withdrawal allowed the Arameans and others to gain independence and take a firm control of what is today Syria during the 11th and early 10th centuries BC. In fact, so many Arameans moved to the east of the Euphrates, where they settled in such numbers that for a time the whole region became known as Aram Naharaim, or Aram of the Two Rivers. Eastern Aramean tribes spread into Babylonia, and an Aramean usurper was crowned king of Babylon. Eventually, in 1047 BC, the 12 tribes of Israel united into the Kingdom of Israel. Over time, many of the Israelites converted to polytheism, and the ones who didn't split off and formed the Kingdom of Judah in 1010 BC. Today, the religion of the ancient inhabitants of Judah is called Judaism. Then the Mediterranean economy recovered. This can be credited to Phoenician mariners and merchants who re-established long-distance trade between Egypt and Mesopotamia in the 10th century BC. And in 945 BC, much of northern Egypt became united under a Libyan dynasty thanks to this new economic stability. It was also around this time that political leaders of tribal communities managed to create a huge commonwealth of tribes on the edge of the Sahad Desert called the Sabaean Kingdom. Then the Chaldeans migrated into the southeastern corner of Mesopotamia around 940 to 860 BC. That's it for part 1, folks. Part 2 will cover up until the year after the death of Alexander the Great, and will be uploaded in 5 days from now.